The night Clara Harrington, the iron-willed CEO, feared across the city, decided to secretly follow her janitor, she expected to find nothing more than a tired man heading home. Instead, what she discovered shattered her world. In a rundown neighborhood, under a flickering streetlight, David Miller, once invisible in her empire, was met by a little girl who leapt into his arms. His hard edges melted into tenderness as he carried her into a house filled with children's drawings and the fading photo of a wife long gone. Clara stood frozen in the shadows, her heart pounding. Why did this janitor feel like the most powerful man she had ever seen? Stay with us, because what happens next will change everything. Clara Harrington had built her life on precision. Every morning unfolded in neat, rehearsed steps. The chauffeur at 7 sharp, the glass tower office gleaming like a mirror against the city's skyline, meetings lined in 15-minute increments, decisions delivered with a clipped efficiency that earned her the name Iron Lady. To her board, to the press, even to her so-called friends, she was untouchable. Yet tonight, Clara found herself doing something that would have horrified the version of herself who ran empires by day. She was following one of her janitors. David Miller was a man most people never saw. He moved through the Harrington Corporation's offices like a shadow, mop in hand, the faint scent of disinfectant trailing in his wake. But Clara had noticed details others dismissed: the steadiness in his eyes, the way his shoulders bore weight heavier than buckets and trash bags, and how he always lingered long after the last elevator had gone silent. For weeks she had caught glimpses of him staring at his phone with an unreadable expression, or pausing in the deserted lobby as if gathering courage before stepping out into the night. Curiosity had not been a trait Clara allowed herself. In her world, curiosity was weakness. Still, when the hour hand crawled past 10 and David slipped out of the service exit, she was waiting in her car across the street, headlights dimmed. She told herself it was management's duty to know their employees. She told herself it was rational. But when her driver raised an eyebrow, Clara dismissed him and took the wheel herself. This was something she could not delegate. The city looked different from behind David's battered pickup truck. His taillights flickered against potholes that no luxury sedan ever dared touch. He drove without hurry, as if he had nowhere to be and everywhere to protect. Clara tightened her grip on the steering wheel, wondering what she expected to find. A secret lover? A second job? Debt collectors? She was prepared for disappointment. What she wasn't prepared for was tenderness. David parked in front of a narrow duplex where the porch light sputtered like a dying star. Clara stayed in the shadows, watching as the janitor stepped out, his movements weary but careful. Then the front door burst open, and a small figure hurled itself into his arms. A girl no older than 8 wrapped herself around his neck, and his whole body softened. Clara saw his face transform, the rigid lines melting into something achingly gentle. He pressed a kiss to the child's hair, and for the first time, Clara wondered if she had ever been looked at with that kind of devotion. She rolled the window down a fraction, enough to catch the sound of laughter. It startled her. Laughter like that did not belong in these streets of peeling paint and broken fences. David carried the girl inside, one arm holding her close as if she were both anchor and lifeline. Clara hesitated only a moment before slipping out of her car and approaching quietly. Through a gap in the worn curtains, she glimpsed the interior. The house was small, almost crumbling, but alive in ways her glass tower never was. Crayon drawings bloomed across the walls, each signed Emma in large, uneven letters. A photo frame hung crooked above the mantel. David, younger, with a woman whose smile seemed carved from sunlight. The woman's absence in the room was louder than any presence. On the table stood a candle burned halfway down, next to what looked like a child's attempt at spaghetti dinner. Clara's chest tightened at the sight. Her gaze drifted back to David. He moved through the kitchen with sleeves rolled up, humming under his breath while Emma sat at the table, chattering about school. He listened, not the distracted nod Clara had seen in countless boardrooms, but with full, undivided attention. Every word from the child was treated as treasure. For reasons she could not name, Clara stepped back, heart pounding. She was intruding. Yet she could not force herself to leave. Something in that room called to a place she thought long buried. Perhaps it was the faded photograph of the wife who was no longer there, or the drawings that tried to keep her alive. Perhaps it was the way David's shoulders finally eased only when his daughter was safe in his arms. Whatever it was, Clara knew this was not the story she had expected to uncover. Standing in the cool night air, hidden by shadows, the Iron Lady felt a tremor she could not suppress. For years she had believed power made her invincible. But here, watching a janitor in a crumbling house surrounded by crayons and grief, Clara felt something she had not felt in decades, her own heart stirring, uncertain and alive. And she whispered to herself, "What on earth have I stepped into?" David Miller's life had not always been defined by mops and broken light bulbs. Once, he had been a rising engineer, a man whose hands drew blueprints that could shape skylines. He was the kind of man colleagues turned to when machinery groaned or when complex equations refused to balance. His mind was quick, his designs daring, his future bright. But the past had a cruel way of cutting through even the strongest plans. Years ago, before the janitor's uniform, before the weary eyes, David had stood in front of executives at Harrington Corporation with a folder of schematics clutched tight. He had warned them. A flaw small, overlooked, but dangerous lurked in a structural project. His voice had carried urgency, but his words were dismissed, filed under caution exaggerated. Weeks later, a collapse took his wife, Anna, from him. The company settled quietly, the headlines faded, but the scar never healed. David did not fight in court. He didn't have the strength. He left engineering behind, took the first job that would keep food on the table, and poured everything he had left into raising Emma. Clara knew none of this when she followed him, but she began to sense the weight of something more than financial struggle. On one of those evenings when her curiosity overwhelmed her better judgment, she found herself once again outside his worn house. The porch light buzzed, moths circling in endless loops, while inside Emma scribbled with colored pencils at the kitchen table. David was rummaging through a wooden box, the kind that looked too fragile to survive years of grief. When he opened it, Clara saw sheets of yellowed paper designs, technical drawings, blueprints filled with lines and annotations too precise to be hobby sketches. She recognized brilliance even from afar. Emma looked up at her father. "Are those the ones Mom liked?" she asked softly. David smiled, though it was a smile cracked by memory. "Yes, sweetheart. She always believed in them." "In me." His voice lowered, thick with the weight of ghosts. Clara pressed her hand against the wall outside, unsure why her throat felt tight. Later, as David tucked Emma into bed, the girl pulled a small notebook from under her pillow. "I wrote another letter for Mommy," she whispered. "Can I read it to you?" David nodded, settling beside her as she unfolded the page. Her voice trembled, but she read with determination. "Dear Mommy, today I told the teacher my dad is a janitor. Some kids laughed, and I felt so small. But then I looked at Daddy, and I thought, they don't know he's a hero. I wish you could see him still being strong for me. I miss you every day. Love, Emma." The silence that followed was raw. David kissed her forehead, murmured that her mother would be proud, then slipped out of the room with shoulders heavy. Clara, hidden in the dark, felt her composure fracture. For years she had prided herself on discipline, on never letting emotions dictate choices. Yet listening to a child cling to the memory of a mother while lifting her father into the role of hero pierced something untouched inside her. That night Clara could not sleep. She saw the drawings, the letters, the tenderness of a man who had lost everything yet refused to collapse. She saw Emma's resilience, her hope stitched with grief. And beneath it all, Clara felt an unease she could not name. Why did David's pain feel tethered to her own world? Why did the designs in that fragile wooden box stir memories of reports she once skimmed years ago in conference rooms filled with men who bore her family's name? The questions unsettled her, yet she kept coming back. She began to linger longer, observing from a distance, piecing fragments of their lives together like shards of glass. She saw Emma's backpack patched with tape, her shoes worn thin, yet her smile wide when her father crouched down to listen to her stories. She saw David fix neighbors' broken toasters and lawnmowers, refusing payment with a gentle shake of his head. Every act was a quiet rebellion against despair, proof that dignity could exist even in ruin. But Clara also sensed that something was buried deeper, a truth neither father nor daughter had spoken aloud. And though she did not yet understand it, she felt the shadows of her own family's legacy brushing against theirs. For the first time in decades, Clara Harrington feared not what the world might think of her, but what she might discover about herself. Weeks passed, and Clara found herself drawn back again and again to that modest house where crayons bloomed across peeling walls and love seemed to patch holes that money never could. Against her instincts, she had begun stepping inside, at first under flimsy pretext, dropping off books for Emma, offering spare groceries, inventing excuses that embarrassed her as soon as the words left her lips. David was wary, his gratitude stiff, but Emma's open joy softened the space between them. Clara had never been welcomed by a child before, and each smile, each tug at her sleeve, chipped away at her armor. Yet with each visit, the gnawing weight in her chest grew heavier. She couldn't ignore the echo of David's designs, the shadow of a collapse she vaguely remembered from her early years at Harrington Corporation, a scandal smothered before it could ignite. The truth broke open on a rainy afternoon. Clara had invited David to a charity event at the Harrington Foundation headquarters, thinking perhaps he and Emma deserved an evening beyond their neighborhood. David hesitated, but Emma pleaded, and so he came, wearing a second-hand suit that did nothing to disguise the quiet dignity in his posture. The room glittered with donors and reporters, glasses chiming under chandeliers, but the warmth in Emma's hand anchored him. Clara tried to tell herself this was just kindness. Deep down, she knew it was more. The evening unraveled when a journalist, bold and relentless, stood during the Q&A and asked Clara directly about a project from years ago, the structural collapse, the fatalities, the hidden reports. Gasps rippled across the room. Cameras turned like hunting dogs. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. And there, at the back of the hall, stood David. His eyes, usually steady, now burned with grief barely restrained. For a moment, Clara wanted to retreat, to deflect with the practiced poise that had carried her through boardroom battles, but she couldn't not with David's gaze cutting through her. She ended the event abruptly, excusing herself, heart pounding like war drums. That night, she descended into the company's archives, demanding access no one dared deny her. She sifted through files that smelled of dust and neglect, until her hands froze on a folder marked in her father's handwriting. Inside were reports, warnings, memos, among them a name, David Miller. His engineering notes were there, clear and urgent, flagged but dismissed. He had predicted the failure. He had begged for redesign. And her father, then CEO, had signed the order to bury it. The pieces locked into place with sickening clarity. The widow, the child, the broken career, all collateral her family had quietly walked over. Clara sank into the leather chair, the weight of betrayal crushing her. Her empire, her legacy, was built on silence purchased with someone else's loss. The next day, Clara returned to David's house. Rain streaked down her coat as she knocked, her breath clouding in the cold. David opened the door, face stern. Emma squealed with delight and reached for her, but David's hand on his daughter's shoulder stopped her. His eyes were not unkind, but they were wary. Clara stepped inside anyway, holding a trembling folder. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice lower than he had ever heard it. She placed the documents on his table. David's hands shook as he flipped through them, his jaw tightening with each page. Then he stopped, staring at a grainy still frame clipped from an old security feed. Himself, younger, standing in a conference room with designs in hand, pointing to weaknesses no one had cared to see. Clara swallowed hard. You were right. They ignored you, and my father. He was the one who buried it. The silence was unbearable. Emma looked between them, confused. David closed the folder, his knuckles white. So you've known all along? He asked, voice rough. No, Clara whispered. I didn't, but I do now. And I can't undo what happened, but I can't look away either. For the first time since she had met him, David's composure cracked. His anger flared, but beneath it was something sharper, the raw wound of recognition. Here was the woman whose name crowned the empire that had stolen his life. Clara felt the ground tilt, but she didn't run. She stood in the wreckage of truth, waiting, terrified, but unwilling to hide. The folder lay between them like a wound reopened, its pages heavy with proof of betrayal. David's face was carved from stone, his jaw clenched tight as he tried to contain years of rage and grief. Clara's voice faltered in the silence. I can't change what happened, David, but I can change what happens now. His eyes burned as he shook his head. You think you can walk in here with apologies and paperwork and undo a lifetime. My wife is dead. Emma grows up without a mother because of choices your family made. And you, his voice cracked, you carry their name. He turned away, the dismissal clear. But before he could close the door on her, Emma tugged at his sleeve, eyes wide and trembling. Daddy, don't. She's different. She listens. Don't send her away. The words, simple and earnest, pierced deeper than any accusation. Clara left that night with her resolve hardened. She could no longer be the silent inheritor of her father's sins. The next morning, she called an emergency board meeting. Executives filled the polished mahogany table, their eyes sharp with suspicion. Clara stood at the head, spine straight, the incriminating folder in her hands. I've uncovered evidence that Harrington Corporation concealed warnings of structural flaws that led to the East River collapse. The engineer who raised the alarm, David Miller, was ignored. The cover-up was signed by my father. A stunned hush fell. One board member, pale and sweating, muttered, Clara, this is suicide. Another hissed, do you realize the lawsuits this will trigger? Clara's voice did not waver. Yes, and it's time the truth was acknowledged. I will not lead a company built on lies. The fallout was immediate. News outlets devoured the confession, headlines blazing across screens. Harrington heiress exposes corporate cover-up. Investors fled, regulators descended, and the board scrambled to save themselves. Clara refused to shift blame. She stepped into the press conference with cameras flashing like lightning, her prepared speech in hand but her heart speaking louder. For years, Harrington Corporation has built its reputation on innovation and strength. But strength without integrity is collapse waiting to happen. I cannot undo the damage my father caused, nor can I erase the lives altered by his choices. But I can tell the truth. And I will. Her words cracked open the fortress of silence. Some jeered, others applauded, but no one doubted her resolve. Back in the quiet of his home, David watched the broadcast on a flickering television. Emma clutched his arm, whispering. She told the truth. Daddy, she stood up for you. For the first time in years, David felt his name spoken without shame, his warnings validated in front of the world. But bitterness still tangled with relief. Vindication couldn't bring Anna back. Still, something shifted inside him, an iron weight loosening just enough for him to breathe. Days later, Clara returned to his doorstep. Her career was hanging by a thread, the empire she had inherited crumbling under lawsuits and scrutiny, but her eyes held a clarity he had never seen. I stepped down, she said quietly. I've given up the chair. They'll rebuild without me, or maybe not at all. But the truth belongs to you now, David. Your work, your name, your voice, it's yours again. She slid a folder across the table. This one filled not with lies but with recognition. Acknowledgement of his designs, credit restored, a path to claim what had once been stolen. David stared at the documents, then at the woman who had risked everything to deliver them. Anger still simmered, but it was no longer blinding. He could see the toll her choices had taken, the courage it had cost her. Emma's small hand slipped into Clara's, as if she had already decided what her father had not. "Don't go," the child whispered. "You've seen him, really seen him. That means you're family now, right?" Clara blinked hard against the tears threatening to rise. She had stood before presidents and billionaires without faltering, but one little girl's words undid her. David exhaled slowly, shoulders slumping under the release of decades. He didn't offer forgiveness, not yet, but he didn't turn her away either. And that, for now, was enough. The weeks after Clara's resignation were a blur of headlines and hearings, but within the storm, a quieter transformation began. David, no longer a shadow in his own story, found doors opening that had long been sealed shut. With Clara's help, he reclaimed his professional record, his patents restored, and his designs acknowledged as the foundation of projects once stolen. Yet he chose not to return to the sterile boardrooms that had discarded him. Instead, he rented a small warehouse on the edge of town, its cracked windows letting in shafts of sunlight that lit up workbenches and scattered blueprints. There, he began to teach. Young men and women from the neighborhood kids, overlooked by universities, written off by the system, came to learn from the janitor who was once an engineer. David's hands guided them patiently, showing them how to coax possibility from steel and circuit boards, how to hear the hum of a machine like a heartbeat. The workshop became a sanctuary, and slowly it became a community. Clara was often there, though she had no title to hide behind anymore. She swept floors without hesitation, fetched tools, even burned her hands once trying to weld under David's instruction. Emma adored those afternoons. To her, Clara wasn't the Iron Lady anymore. She was simply the woman who listened, who tried, who laughed when sparks flew the wrong way. At night, Clara stayed for dinner, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes just herself. Emma would chatter about school while Clara helped stir the pot of soup, and David would find himself staring at the two of them across the table, wondering when the silence of his house had been replaced with warmth again. One evening, as autumn bled into winter, Emma bounded into the workshop holding a folded piece of paper. She handed it shyly to Clara. "I drew something," she said, cheeks flushed. Clara unfolded the page and pressed a hand to her lips. In bright crayons, Emma had drawn 3 figures under a small red-roofed house: a tall man with kind eyes, a woman with long hair, and a little girl with her arms stretched wide. Above them, in blocky letters, Emma had written, "Family means we don't walk alone." Clara's throat tightened. David, watching from the workbench, felt a pang that was both grief and hope. He remembered Anna, her belief in his dreams, her laughter that used to fill these walls. For a moment, guilt rose like a tide, but then he saw Emma's eyes hopeful, unbroken, and realized she was not asking for replacement, but for continuation. In time, Clara moved into a modest house down the street, close enough that Emma could run over after school. The neighborhood that once pitied the single dad began to whisper a different story, that of resilience, of unexpected love, of a family stitched together not by bloodlines or contracts, but by choice. On weekends, the 3 of them planted a small garden behind the workshop. Clara, who had once lived in glass towers, knelt in dirt without complaint, laughing when Emma splattered mud on her dress. David, watching, felt a peace he had thought lost forever. One night, after Emma had fallen asleep, Clara and David sat on the porch steps, the chill of winter softened by the glow of the workshop's lights. Clara broke the silence. "I've spent my life chasing legacies," she said quietly. "My father's my own. But maybe legacy isn't about buildings or stock prices. Maybe it's about whether someone can sit here, years from now, and still feel safe. David looked at her, seeing not the CEO who once symbolized his loss, but the woman who had chosen to risk everything for truth. Maybe, he said, legacy is just love that outlives us. As snow began to fall, Emma stirred inside, muttering in her sleep, and Clara smiled. The girl had begun calling her Aunt Clara without prompting, and though the title was simple, the weight of it filled Clara's heart with a sense of belonging she had never known. By spring, the workshop bore a new sign above its door, the Miller Harrington Center for Youth Engineering. It was David's idea to include both names, and Clara had argued at first, but he insisted. "You carried the truth into the light," he told her. "That makes you part of this." On opening day, the community gathered. Children raced through the aisles of workbenches, and Emma cut the ribbon with oversized scissors, giggling. The applause that followed wasn't for one man or one woman, it was for what they had built together. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Clara sat beside David on the porch of the workshop, Emma between them, holding both their hands. The girl leaned her head against Clara's shoulder and whispered, "We're not alone anymore," and for the first time in years, David believed it. The chains of grief had not vanished, but they no longer bound him. Instead, they had been reforged into something stronger, a home, a family, and a future where love and truth walked side by side. In the end, what began as suspicion turned into redemption, and what was once a wound became the root of something new. David, the single dad who carried grief in silence, found his voice restored. Clara, the CEO who had lived behind glass towers, discovered that truth and love mattered more than power. And Emma, with her crayons and her courage, stitched them all into one family. Their story reminds us that healing isn't about erasing the past. It's about building a future where no one walks alone. If this journey touched your heart, let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Soul-Stirring Tales, because sometimes the most ordinary lives hide the most extraordinary truths.